After Julius Caesar heads back down to Cisalpine Gaul for the winter and leaves his army behind, he's hanging out for a little bit. And he ends up receiving word that the Belgae, right, or Belgium, the Belgian people, are forming a confederacy to try and take on Rome. Now, this is where we start getting into a part of the story where, unlike the last book, I will say that it feels kind of like Caesar's lying about some stuff, but it all just feels really convenient. Because Caesar no longer is looking for a casus belli. He's no longer looking for a reason to start a war. He's just doing what he wants at this point. And so he hears about all these Belgae forming this massive army. And he shows up, come the next fighting season, right in spring, to the closest one of these people's territory. I think it's the Remi or the Remi or something like that. And they immediately give up. And when they come to Julius Caesar, they tell him, look, we know everything about this confederation that's forming. We know exactly how many soldiers there are. And they start going down the list, and they're like, these guys are giving 150,000 soldiers. These guys are giving 10,000 soldiers. These other two guys are also giving 10,000 soldiers each. This tribe's giving 60,000 soldiers, and these other two tribes are giving 60,000 soldiers. It's just a massive army. And by Caesar's estimation, the army itself is somewhere close to 368,000 people or something like that. And which is the same amount that the Helvetii had, except the Helvetii was 3/4 women and children. This is supposedly a massive force of fighting men. And so Caesar raises 2 more legions. And now Caesar has 8 legions, something close to 50,000 men, twice the amount of soldiers he was allowed to have by the Senate. And he starts marching into, Belgae territory. He's marching into Belgium, and he's immediately looking for these people. But before he gets there, what he does is he tells our good old friend Diviciacus, right, the leader of the Aedui, he tells him, take the auxiliaries and go to the Bellovaci territory, because the Bellovaci are the largest portion of this confederacy. Go to their territory, go to their homeland, and start burning and killing everything. So they do that. And Caesar is just trucking along with his, massive army, but there's an even more massive army waiting for it. Caesar makes camp at this spot just outside of this little fortified town. And there's a river between that he has to cross to get there. It's kind of like a Y point of a river, and he's kind of in the crux of the Y there. And then this Belgae force of supposedly hundreds of thousands of people shows up, and they immediately start going for the town instead of going for Caesar. And the people of the town send word to Caesar, and they're like, hey man, we're going to die without your help. Please help us. And Caesar is smelling a trap. And so he takes the men that he left on the other side of the river to guard his crossing. And they're Numidians, right? It was really badass soldiers. Basically, I think the Numidians come from like modern day, like Ethiopia, Somalia area, south of Egypt. But he sends these Numidians and a few other people into the town in secret to help fortify their walls. And so they help fight back this force that's coming against the town. And the Belgae, seeing that Caesar, isn't really going for this bait, they decide to attack Caesar directly. Now, they set up lines on the other side of this river. Caesar sets up his own lines on his side of the river. And he doesn't immediately engage because, like he said, this is a massive force and he's scared. And so what the Belgae do is they actually send people across the other river where Caesar's other men are holding the line, holding their rear, and start attacking them. Caesar sees that and he goes, no, I don't think so. He grabs a bunch of his infantry, a bunch of his cavalry, and goes across the river to help these guys. And they catch the Belgae that are crossing over the river as they're like halfway through crossing the river, and just slaughter them. I mean, they slaughter all the ones on this side of the river, and he talks about how the people that are still in the river are just getting torn to shreds by, arrows and javelins and sling bullets, and it's just a massacre. So then Caesar goes back to his camp, and that kind of ends the first day of this. But my gosh, that was like 50 potholes. That night, allegedly, the Bellovici receive word of what's going on in their homeland, and all the tribes of this confederacy get together and they're like, yeah, we should all go home and defend our homes from the Romans, every man for himself. Now Caesar, one thing Caesar describes when he's talking about the enemy camp and how big it is, he says that you can tell how big the enemy's camp is at night because of their fires. He says the fires stretch for 8 miles across, which is insane, right? This is, like I said, this is where I start to go, was there even a confederacy coming after you, or was it just an excuse for you to pretend to be, defending yourself? Whatever, I'm still going to talk about it because it's cool. And so Caesar sees all this camp basically just fall apart in the middle of the night, right? He says that basically sometime around midnight, everyone just starts leaving, and it's completely unorganized, and everyone's like rushing to be the first ones on the road, the first ones to get home. And Caesar thinks it might be some kind of trap, so he doesn't do anything about it. He just watches them go. And then when he realizes what's happening, he's like, okay, cool. Now we divided. Now it's time to conquer. And so he starts making his way across Belgium. Meets up with the auxiliary forces that were burning up the Bellovici's territory. Oh, I'm in the middle of the line. God, I hate when it's snowing. And he gets there, and these 2 big tribes almost immediately surrender to him. There's some fighting, it's kind of cool stuff, and I was originally going to talk about that, but everything that comes after it is just so cool, like I have to get to that part. So Caesar takes over these 2 tribal areas and makes them allies of his, right? And 1 minute. I got stuff to do.
Hi, what can I get you?
Yeah, I'll have a... And so, yeah, as Caesar was taking over these places, the other Belgae had time to kind of fortify and decide what they really wanted to do. And they had enough time to get ready to fight. So that's exactly what they're doing. They get together and they say, no, we're going to resist. And they start talking crap, making statements about the other tribes of the Belgae that immediately surrendered to Caesar, even the ones that fought. They're talking crap about him. And so Caesar's like, well, guess that means you're next. And so he starts heading out up into that area, more towards the northeast, kind of close to where, I think kind of close to like Normandy. I don't know. I'd have to look at a map. You'll know before me. He gets up into that territory, and as he's pushing up, you got to remember he has a massive army at this point. And I'm going to link a video in the description of this one, hopefully show you a screenshot of it. But it's a good visual representation of just how hard it was to move a single legion from point A to point B. And Caesar has 8 of these fucking things. So it takes a long time to get anywhere, and it's really hard to get anywhere, and you're really vulnerable when you're moving from point A to point B. So Caesar keeps his 6 main experienced legions at the front of the line, because those are the ones he's been fighting with. He fought with over the last year. And then he has a long baggage train, and then 2 more legions at the very back. Those are the 2 fresh legions that he created. They're holding up the rear for him. Caesar's moving through. It comes to a point when he's ready to, camp again, because it takes them multiple days to get anywhere. So it's just another day. They pick a good spot on a hillside where there's a slope down to a river, and then it slopes back up into an even taller hill that's covered in trees. But Caesar chooses this bare hillside. And when he gets there, this is one of the dumbest things Caesar's ever done, by the way. When he gets to this hill, he's like, oh, we're going to set up camp here. He notices that the Belgae have set up a wall made out of like bushes and briars and little trees and stuff. It's this huge wall that you can't see through of foliage. And Caesar's like, oh, this is a good place to set up camp. We'll just cut it down. There's no way this is an ambush. And so he starts setting up camp, and all of his soldiers, they sheath their swords, put down their spears and javelins, cover up their shields with, their coverings, take off their helmets, and they get to work setting up camp. They're, chopping down trees and setting up tents and cook fires, and a bunch of guys are out foraging, looking for supplies, firewood and stuff like that. And so they're starting to fortify this camp. And while they're doing that, Caesar sends his cavalry. And he's like, hey, go across that river over there. Just look around. Make sure there's no spies, right? Make sure there's no scouts seeing where we are right now. So the cavalry crosses the river. It's a very shallow river, so they're able to just walk right across it on their horses, of course. And they get to the other side of the river, and they do see enemy cavalry. And they're like, oh, sweet. And so they engage this enemy cavalry. And Caesar's basically just standing on this hillside, watching this situation go down. He's like, oh, they caught some scouts. Cool. They start chasing off these enemy cavalry because they outnumber them by a lot. Caesar's cavalry are chasing them up the side of this hill, up towards the tree line. And it turns out that the Belgae had their entire army formed up in ranks in that forest waiting on Caesar. And they immediately break out of the woods and slam into the cavalry. And they break the cavalry. And Caesar sees this. And the way Caesar describes it is terrifying, right? He says that they were moving so quickly that it was like they were in the woods and in the river and on top of them at the same time. They moved so quickly, just hauling ass, cutting ass down the side of this down the side of this hill, across the river, and then back up Caesar's hill, where his camp is. And Caesar, describes how insane it is to try to get everything together. Because when you're trying to get lines together, it takes a lot of commands. It takes a long time to get a good army line together. There's a ton of commands that you have to do. And remember, these guys have their helmets off, their shields are down, their swords are sheathed. A bunch of their guys are across, out foraging. Everybody's mixed up. Nobody's really with their units. Everyone's mingling with their buddies. And all of a sudden they're getting the call, to arms. It's time to go right now. Existential crisis mode here. We're outnumbered and we're getting caught by surprise. And so they start to form lines, and Caesar says something that I'll actually let him tell you exactly what he said, because it's one of the coolest parts of this whole book so far. Caesar, having given the necessary orders, hastened to and fro into whatever quarter fortune carried him to animate the troops, and came to the 10th Legion. Having encouraged the soldiers with no further speech than that, quote, they should keep up the remembrance of their wonted valor, and not be confused in mind, but valiantly sustain the assault of the enemy, end quote. As the latter were not farther from them than the distance to which a dart could be cast, he gave the signal for commencing battle. And having gone to another quarter for the purpose of encouraging the soldiers, he finds them fighting. Such was the shortness of the time, and so determined was the mind of the enemy on fighting, that time was wanting not only for affixing the military insignia, but even for putting on the helmets and drawing off the covers from the shields. To whatever part anyone by chance came from the works in which they had been employed, and whatever standards he saw first, at these he stood, lest in seeking his own company he should lose the time for fighting. And so that last part there, when Caesar is talking about, the banners and men not knowing where to go and which banners to form up on, those banners were basically like big calling cards saying like, hey, this is where your company is. This is where your cohort is. Rally around the banner and then you'll find your boys. You'll be able to fall into line correctly. But it's such chaos that these soldiers are basically they're just going up and they don't know anyone around them. And they're like, well, in my unit, I would fall into place here. So I'll just fall into place here, right? They're forming these haphazard legions together. Because everyone was so mixed up at the beginning, nobody knows where to go. So as they're forming up, they barely manage to create something that's workable. And it reminds me a lot of D-Day, when the paratroopers were jumping into Normandy. There was a lot of chaos. If you've watched Band of Brothers, you know what I'm talking about, where they landed and it would be like, hey, what company are you with? Oh, I'm with this company. Well, you're 3 miles off of your objective. No, you're 3 miles off of your objective. It was a lot of just, hello, Sergeant, I'm Private so-and-so. I don't have my gun or any of my gear. What do you want me to do? I've never met you before in my life. That's the vibe I get from Caesar's army at this point. The Belgae come cutting up the side of the hill, and they slam into Caesar's men. Caesar's army is basically divided into 3 parts at this point. Caesar's 10th mounted, which aren't mounted at this point, Caesar's 10th Legion and the 9th Legion are over on this side, and Caesar's just running around trying to keep everything together. Now, on the left side of the battlefield, Caesar's 10th mounted managed to push back the people that they're fighting against. They're pushing them back far. The center of Caesar's army also manages to push their people back, but not as quickly. And then the right side is where the Nervii are. And the Nervii are the ones that formed this whole confederacy, right? They're the biggest chunk of this army. And so Caesar's legions on the right are getting their ass kicked and they're getting pushed back. On the left side, Caesar's 10th and 9th legions managed to push their tribesmen all the way back across the river, up the hill, backwards, all the way back to the enemy camp, almost. Meanwhile, on Caesar's right, his men are breaking bad, and they're getting pushed back further and further, and it's to the point where the Belgae are actually starting to melt around Caesar's flanks, and they're getting into Caesar's camp, and they've pushed the men all the way back to Caesar's camp. Caesar goes and gives them his biggest support, his most attention right now, because they're the ones that need it. He's trying to hold them together, but when they get around to the rear, they find the broken cavalry from earlier, the ones that were routed, and they rout them again. The cavalry runs away. They say, hell no, we're not going to be a part of this. They're already in the camp. The camp followers see this, and they start to run away. right? Broken Arrow, it's over. We're done. We are hundreds of miles from home, and the strongest army in the world is getting destroyed right now. So the camp followers are all running away. Caesar's soldiers start to run away. The ones on the front lines, they are breaking. And they're running, they're injured, they're exhausted. And according to Caesar, this is what he does about it. According to Caesar, he catches one of these soldiers that's retreating, rips the shield out of his hand, puts it on, and basically like Mel Gibson in The Patriot, starts running in the opposite direction of where all of his men are running. He's running towards the front lines. His men are running away from the front lines. And he starts grabbing centurions, the ones that are still alive, and calling them by name and basically saying, "Where are you going? Let's go. You're going the wrong way." Grabbing the standard bearers, telling them to put the standards up, keep going back this way. And that manages to rally his men enough to push back. A good way I could describe this is like, imagine being a soldier, once again in World War II, your whole unit is about to be completely destroyed, and then Chesty Puller or General Patton show up at the front lines and are like, "Hey man, aren't we supposed to be going to Berlin? Aren't we supposed to be going to Tokyo? You're going the wrong way. Let's go, turn around." It's going to make you want to fight, right? You're going to be like, well, shit, it's time to go. So his men managed to rally and fight back, but even Caesar at this point admits that it doesn't do much except for delay what's happening. They're not actually winning, they're just buying a bit more time. Now, as all these auxiliary and camp followers are running away, remember Caesar's supply train is still coming in at this point, and they start to run away. So the legions, the two new legions at the very back of the formation, hear what's going on. They start double timing it, hauling ass to the front because Caesar needs help. Meanwhile, the 10th Legion gets up on this other hill, the enemy's hill, turns around and looks. The commander of the 10th and 9th Legions looks back, sees that the enemies are in the camp, and Caesar's about to die. And the 10th Legion goes cutting ass back down the mountain, across the river, and back up into the Belgai's rear, into the Nervii's rear. They manage to get there about the same time that the other two new fresh legions get there, and they come and fuck the Nervii in the ass. So now the Nervii are getting just completely demolished from all sides. They're completely surrounded. They're getting cut to pieces. And Caesar himself talks about how impressive it was and how valiantly these Gauls, these barbarians, fought. And I'll let him tell you about that as well.
But the enemy, even in the last hope of safety, displayed such great courage that when the foremost of them had fallen, the next stood upon them prostrate, and fought from their bodies. When these were overthrown, and their corpses heaped up together, those who survived cast their weapons against our men thence, as from a mound, and returned our darts which had fallen between the armies, so that it ought not be concluded that men of such great courage had injudiciously dared to pass a very broad river, ascend very high banks, and come up to a very disadvantageous place, since their greatness of spirit had rendered these accusations easy, although in themselves very difficult.
And so Caesar has officially defeated this Belgae coalition somewhat. He somewhat defeated it. One of these people that got pushed back by the center, they run away and they go home. And a bunch of these other tribes are staying in their areas, and they start to get ready for Caesar to come. And Caesar is kind of assessing the situation at the end of the battle. They get up to the camp of the Nervii, and they find the women and children, or women and old men, as he describes it. And they tell Caesar that of the 100 senators or important people that they brought with them, only 5 of them are still alive. And of the 60,000 men, fighting men they brought with them, only 500 are still alive that could fight. So Caesar's like, all right, cool, hell yeah. He starts setting out after the rest of these Belgian tribes. one of these tribes, they were the ones that were retreating. They abandoned all of their forts, all of their villages, and they fortify themselves in this one town, which at this point, it shouldn't be called a town, it should be called a city, because the population is pretty high. They get to this fortified city, and they double fortify it. When Caesar arrives, they have double walls. They have 2 layers of high walls made out of spiked wood and deep trenches all around it and big heavy gates. Caesar starts setting up camp, and he describes something really funny. He describes how the Belgae that are in this town are standing along the walls, and they're looking at these Italians, right? These Romans that have showed up, and they're hurling insults down at them and talking crap to them. And he literally says they're like calling them short, a bunch of short little Italians. What are you boys doing down there with your little soft hands, right? Just talking crap about them. And Caesar's like, oh, we are much smaller than them. They are much larger than us. And then they didn't understand what we were trying to do. What the Belgae see from the inside of their town is they see far off in the distance, Caesar's men are building a tower. They start building a tower. And they're hurling insults down at these Romans, saying, what are you going to do with that tower all the way over there? That doesn't make any sense. What are you guys, stupid? And Caesar says that their mood changes when they start to see the tower moving towards them. Because apparently they've never seen a siege engine of this height, right? A tall tower that can move. So they sue for peace. They tell Caesar, look, we'll surrender to you. The one condition that we have, though, is that you don't take our weapons from us, because everyone around us hates us. All these other tribes hate us, and they're going to kill us and torture us and sacrifice us the second that you leave. Caesar says, no, I won't do that. But what I can do is tell all the neighboring tribes to not attack you, or I'll come back and kill them. But I'm going to need all your weapons. So these guys, seeing no other choice, they agree, and they start throwing their weapons down. It's described as throwing their weapons over the walls. And they pile up and almost fill up the trench that surrounds it. There's so many weapons. But Caesar says they would later find out that these Belgae actually hid away a bunch of weapons and didn't tell them about it. Caesar goes into the town, accepts their surrender. A bunch of soldiers show up, and he tells his soldiers to leave the town before nightfall, specifically because he doesn't want his soldiers raping people, which is insane. But it happened back then. Obviously, it happens. It happened a lot back then. So Caesar sends his men out of the town. They all go stay at camp. And in the middle of the night, Caesar says that he sees a bunch of fires being lit all over the town. And he knows this is some kind of signal. It's like midnight at this point. It's second watch. I think second watch is around midnight. All these fires getting lit in town. He knows it means the Belgae are about to attack. He forms his lines. The Belgae come out with the weapons that they hid away. They start attacking Caesar's men. Caesar's men beat the shit out of him. And the remaining Belgae flee back into the town. They fortify themselves up there. Caesar says eventually the Romans manage to break down the gates, and he lets his men go. He lets them loose. They go into the city. You should have listened to us. Now my men are actually going to do what they want to do. They go through, they rape and pillage this whole city, take every man, woman, and child hostage. And Caesar himself says that by the time he was done selling the slaves from that town specifically, they had sold over 58,000 people into slavery. Whew. Villain. He's a straight up villain. And then Caesar camps there again, and he sends one of his lieutenants with a single legion to pacify all the rest of the Belgae. And they go all across Belgium, and this one legion manages to pacify everyone because they saw, one, what Rome is capable of, two, what happens when you surrender to Caesar and listen to him, and three, what happens when you don't surrender to Caesar and you don't listen to him. So Caesar has managed to pacify all of Belgium. And he finishes up, and he basically leaves his men there. And he says, he said, because he talks about himself in the third person. He says, Caesar had managed to pacify all of Gaul. He's tooting his own horn, talking about how great he is. And, became extremely rich with slaves and took all their riches, took all of their wealth. And he's happy. And you know what he's going to do now? Well, now it's time to head on back to Italy again, settle in again, relax, and enjoy my last 2 years peacefully, right? We all know that's not going to happen. Even Caesar knows that's not going to happen. It just happens to be wintertime, and it's time to relax until it's time to start committing genocide once again. And that's how that book ends, and it was really good. I loved that battle and how cinematic it was when Caesar's legions were caught off guard. I mean, it was crazy. It was so cool. It was so cool. I loved this book. I didn't think I would. I had to kind of reread some of the pages because I had no idea what was going on. I didn't understand what was going on. But once I caught on to what was going on, I mean, I absolutely loved it. It was great. Totally worth it. That's book 2. There's 8 books in this, though, and I don't understand. I'm pretty sure, from my knowledge of it, I think Caesar only has 2 more things to do. I think he only has to go to Great Britain, or go to Britannia, and go to kill Vercingetorix. And I thought that's all he has left to do, but there's 6 more books left. So I don't know what else he's going to talk about. And the first 2 books covered about 1 year each. And he's only here for 4 years. So there must be a lot going on during that time. Maybe the whole Vercingetorix thing takes a lot longer than what I thought it did. But, is he going to talk about crossing the Rubicon? Is he going to talk about all that? Or is he going to stop? Does the story stop right before he's told, disband your legions and return to Rome? I don't know. We just got to wait and see. But I loved the second book. It was great. Or second part of the story, whatever you want to call it. It was great, and I'm excited to read the third part. So that's it for now. Adios.